The judge recognizes childhood friend on trial. What happens next shocked everyone. The courtroom buzzed with the familiar hum of anticipation, lawyers shuffling papers, spectators whispering in hushed tones, the distant echo of a gavel striking in another chamber. Judge Eleanor Hayes sat at the bench, her hands resting lightly on the polished oak surface, her gaze steady and professional. It was another day, another case. At least, that's what she thought. The State of Louisiana versus James Anderson, the bailiff called. Eleanor's posture shifted ever so slightly, her practiced neutrality faltering for a heartbeat. The name clung to the air, heavy with familiarity. When the defendant was brought in, the world around her seemed to tilt. Shackled at the wrists and ankles, the man standing before her was no stranger. He was James Anderson, her James. Memories surged forward unbidden, summer afternoons racing bicycles, whispered secrets under the magnolia tree, promises made in the naïveté of youth. But the man before her wasn't the boy she remembered. His shoulders were hunched, his face lined with years of hardship, yet his eyes, those same deep, soulful eyes, were unmistakable. For the first time in her career, Eleanor hesitated. The courtroom's hum seemed to fade as the stakes became painfully clear. This wasn't just another case. This was James. Judge Eleanor Hayes was a paragon of professionalism and poise. At 43, she had earned a reputation for her unwavering commitment to justice, her sharp intellect, and her unyielding sense of fairness. Her courtroom was a place where facts and evidence reigned supreme, emotions carefully tempered behind the authority of her black robe. Her rise through the ranks of Louisiana's judicial system had been anything but easy, but Eleanor carried herself with a quiet dignity that belied the challenges she had faced. Born and raised in Hammond, Louisiana, Eleanor had been a precocious child with a penchant for books and an unshakable belief in doing what was right. Her father, a high school principal, and her mother, a nurse, had instilled in her the values of discipline, empathy, and resilience. Yet, even in the relative safety of her modest upbringing, Eleanor had been keenly aware of the divides in her community, lines drawn by race, class, and circumstance. These unspoken barriers shaped her worldview and fueled her determination to make a difference. James Anderson had been a pivotal figure in those formative years. He was the boy from the other side of town, the one who didn't fit into the neat categories society tried to impose. Their friendship had been forged in secret, a defiant act against the segregation that permeated every aspect of their lives. They'd shared everything, dreams, fears, and the fleeting moments of joy that childhood allowed. But that bond had been severed abruptly, a casualty of societal expectations and parental disapproval. Eleanor threw herself into her education, using it as both a shield and a sword. She graduated at the top of her class, earned a scholarship to a prestigious university, and eventually made her way to law school. Her ambition was single-minded, to wield the law as a tool for justice, to ensure that everyone, regardless of background, was treated fairly. It was a noble ideal, though one that often felt unattainable in the flawed system she now presided over. In her personal life, Eleanor was reserved. Her days were consumed by work, her evenings by the quiet solace of her neatly kept home. Friends and colleagues admired her dedication, but few knew the woman beneath the robe. The walls she'd built to protect herself from judgment, from vulnerability, were formidable. And yet, those walls began to crack the moment James Anderson walked back into her life, not as the boy she'd once adored but as the defendant in her courtroom. James's presence was a stark reminder of the past she had buried. It disrupted the carefully curated balance of her life, forcing Eleanor to confront questions she'd long avoided. Who was she beneath the layers of success and propriety? And what would she do now that the boy she couldn't protect had become the man fighting for his freedom in her court? The courtroom's atmosphere shifted as the trial began in earnest, the stakes palpable in every glance exchanged and every word spoken. Judge Eleanor Hayes had presided over countless cases, but this one felt like a fissure in her carefully maintained composure. James Anderson, a man shackled by both metal chains and the weight of his circumstances, sat at the defense table, his posture slouched, his eyes avoiding hers. For Eleanor, the sight of him was an unsettling blend of familiarity and alienation. The prosecutor, Richard Powell, was a seasoned litigator, sharp and relentless. His opening statement was clinical, presenting James as a man whose actions spoke of violence and desperation. Powell painted a picture of a convenience store robbery gone wrong, a clerk assaulted, a register emptied, and James caught nearby with the stolen cash. His voice was unwavering, his confidence bolstered by the seemingly damning evidence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Powell concluded, "this case is about accountability. The evidence will show that the defendant committed these crimes without hesitation. Justice demands that he be held responsible." Eleanor's gaze drifted to James as Powell's words settled over the room. His expression remained inscrutable, but the tension in his frame was unmistakable. It was a stark contrast to the boy she had once known, a boy full of hope and determination. Now, he was a man seemingly stripped of both. The defense attorney, Lisa Porter, rose to deliver her opening remarks. Young but composed, Lisa carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced adversity before. Her words were measured, her tone direct. "The prosecution will tell you a story," Lisa began, "but stories are often incomplete. My client, James Anderson, is not the man they've described. He is a man who has lived a hard life, yes, but one who maintains his innocence. The evidence, as you will see, is far from conclusive." Eleanor admired Lisa's resolve, but her impartiality as a judge demanded she suppress any personal bias. Still, she couldn't ignore the pang of unease as Lisa's words echoed in the courtroom. Was James truly innocent, or was she clinging to a version of him that no longer existed? The prosecution's first witness was the store clerk who had been present during the robbery. His testimony was detailed but rehearsed, his description of the assailant vague yet damning. "He wore a red hoodie," the clerk testified, his hands clasped tightly together. "I couldn't see his face clearly, but he'd been arguing with the cashier just before he lunged over the counter." Lisa's cross-examination was precise. "Mr. Chambers," she began, "you mentioned the assailant wore a red hoodie. Did you see this article of clothing recovered by the police?" The clerk hesitated. "No, but..." "So," Lisa interrupted, "you're unable to definitively identify my client as the man who committed this crime?" I guess not," the clerk admitted, his confidence faltering. Eleanor observed the jury's reaction. Doubt had been planted, but it was far from enough to sway the case. As the trial progressed, more witnesses were called, their testimonies weaving a narrative that seemed solid on the surface yet riddled with inconsistencies under scrutiny. The surveillance footage was next, grainy and poorly lit, showing a figure in a red hoodie entering the store, moving quickly, and disappearing from view. The prosecution argued that the man in the video was James, but the defense challenged the claim. An expert witness pointed out the lack of distinguishing features, raising questions about the reliability of the footage. Eleanor's focus wavered as memories of her childhood with James surfaced unbidden. She thought of the times they had sat by the creek, dreaming of lives unburdened by the weight of societal expectations. Now, those dreams felt like distant whispers, drowned out by the reality of their diverging paths. The prosecution's case continued with Officer Daniel Harris, the arresting officer. His testimony was straightforward. He had apprehended James 2 blocks from the crime scene, matching the suspect's description. "Did you recover any stolen cash or a red hoodie from the defendant?" Lisa asked during cross-examination. Harris's jaw tightened. "No, but he could have discarded them before I caught up with him." Lisa pressed further. "Did you or any other officers search the surrounding area for this alleged red hoodie?" "No, we didn't have time." "So, you made an arrest based on a vague description and circumstantial evidence." Lisa's tone was sharp, her words landing like blows. Harris's silence spoke volumes. Eleanor glanced at the jury, noting the uncertainty in their expressions. The cracks in the prosecution's case were becoming evident, but they were not yet enough to exonerate James. When the defense called James to the stand, the courtroom tensed. Lisa had warned him of the risks, but James insisted. Shackled and weary, he spoke with a raw honesty that resonated in the stillness of the room. "I've made mistakes," James admitted, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "But I didn't do this. That night, I was walking home, minding my own business, when the cops stopped me. They didn't ask questions. They just decided I fit the bill." As James's words hung in the air, Eleanor struggled to maintain her impartiality. She saw the boy he once was, the man he had become, and the system that had shaped him. Her role demanded neutrality, but her heart ached with the weight of what was at stake. When the court adjourned for the day, Eleanor lingered at the bench, her fingers tracing the edge of the gavel. The initial conflict was clear, a battle between the truth she sought and the memories she couldn't escape. As she watched James being escorted out of the courtroom, his chains clinking softly, Eleanor knew that this trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning with the past, a test of her resolve, and a confrontation with the justice she had sworn to uphold. As the trial pressed forward, the courtroom became a crucible of tension, each moment turning the screws tighter on Judge Eleanor Hayes' composure. The legal battle between the prosecution and defense intensified, revealing cracks not just in the case but in Eleanor's carefully constructed sense of impartiality. She watched as lives unraveled before her, James Anderson at the center of it all, a man caught between a past Eleanor couldn't forget and a future that seemed to slip further from his grasp with every passing day. The prosecution introduced new evidence, a partial fingerprint found on the counter of the convenience store. It was incomplete and smudged, but Powell argued that it matched James's left thumb. The forensic analyst took the stand, explaining the limitations of the evidence but affirming that it was enough to suggest James's presence at the scene. Lisa Porter's cross-examination was relentless. "You mentioned the fingerprint is partial," she began, her voice calm but cutting. "Can you confirm beyond a shadow of a doubt that it belongs to my client?" The analyst hesitated. "No. Partial prints can't provide a definitive match. They're suggestive." "Suggestive," Lisa repeated, emphasizing the word. "In other words, inconclusive. Isn't it true that without a complete print, the likelihood of error increases?" "That is correct," the analyst admitted, visibly uncomfortable. Eleanor noted the murmurs from the jury box. Lisa was skillful, planting seeds of doubt without overplaying her hand. But Eleanor also knew how juries often operated, clinging to even the faintest thread of evidence if it fit their preconceived notions. The scales of justice, so delicately balanced in theory, were all too easily tipped by human bias. The next witness was a surprise. Powell called a man named Rodney Carter, a local known for his criminal record. Carter claimed to have seen James near the convenience store shortly before the robbery. His testimony was shaky, riddled with inconsistencies, but Powell leaned heavily on it, framing Carter as an eyewitness who had no reason to lie. Lisa's approach to discrediting Carter was surgical. "Mr. Carter, you've been convicted of perjury in the past, correct?" "That was a long time ago," Carter muttered, shifting uncomfortably. "And you're currently on probation for drug possession, are you not?" Carter's face reddened. "Yeah, but that doesn't mean I'm lying now." "Perhaps not," Lisa said, tilting her head slightly. "But it does mean your testimony should be taken with caution, particularly when no other witnesses corroborate your account." Eleanor couldn't help but admire Lisa's composure. The young defense attorney had an uncanny ability to maintain control, even when the odds were stacked against her. But for every point Lisa scored, Powell countered with calculated precision, using the weight of the system to his advantage. James's alibi remained a contentious point. His friend, Marcus Green, had initially agreed to testify but backed out at the last minute, citing fear of retaliation. Without Marcus, James's defense leaned heavily on the argument that the prosecution's evidence was circumstantial and insufficient. During a recess, Eleanor retreated to her chambers, the weight of the trial pressing down on her. Margaret, her assistant, entered with a tentative knock. "Judge Hayes, are you okay?" Margaret asked, setting a cup of coffee on the desk. Eleanor sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I'm fine, Margaret. This case is complicated." Margaret hesitated before speaking. "You seem different. Distracted. If there's something you need to talk about, I'm here." Eleanor offered a faint smile. "Thank you, Margaret. But I'm fine. Really." As Margaret left, Eleanor stared at the coffee, untouched. She wasn't fine, and she knew it. The memories of her childhood with James were like ghosts, haunting her at every turn. She remembered the promises they'd made, the dreams they'd shared, and the day it had all fallen apart. How could she reconcile the boy she'd known with the man now fighting for his freedom in her courtroom? The defense's next move was bold. Lisa called Officer Daniel Harris back to the stand, this time armed with new evidence. Through a Freedom of Information Act request, Lisa obtained records showing that Harris had been reprimanded in the past for mishandling evidence. "Officer Harris," Lisa began, her tone measured but firm, "are you familiar with the department's disciplinary record system?" Harris's jaw tightened. "Yes." "And is it true that you were disciplined in 2018 for failing to properly log evidence in a robbery case?" Powell objected, but Eleanor overruled him, allowing the line of questioning to proceed. "Yes," Harris admitted reluctantly. "And in this case, did you properly document all evidence recovered from my client at the time of his arrest?" "Yes," Harris said quickly. "Yet you admitted earlier that no physical evidence directly linking my client to the crime was found on his person. Isn't it possible, given your history, that mistakes were made in this case as well?" Harris's silence was deafening. Eleanor observed the jury's reactions closely. Lisa's strategy was working, but Eleanor also knew how fragile doubt could be. It wasn't enough to poke holes, Lisa needed to dismantle the prosecution's case entirely. The turning point came when Lisa introduced her final piece of evidence, a forensic analysis of the surveillance footage. A private expert had reviewed the grainy video and discovered inconsistencies in the timestamps. The footage, it turned out, had been edited, intentionally or not. It cast further doubt on the prosecution's narrative. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Lisa said in her closing arguments, "this case is not about evidence, it's about assumptions. Assumptions made by witnesses, by law enforcement, and by the prosecution. My client deserves better than assumptions. He deserves justice." As Lisa sat down, the tension in the room was palpable. Powell delivered his closing remarks, leaning heavily on the fingerprint and Carter's testimony. Eleanor's heart pounded as she listened. The jury's decision was out of her hands, but the weight of it pressed heavily on her. When the court adjourned for deliberation, Eleanor returned to her chambers, the silence deafening. She stared out the window at the city beyond, her mind racing. This wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning. For James. For herself. For the system she had devoted her life to. Hours later, the jury returned, their expressions unreadable. As the verdict was read, Eleanor's breath caught. The outcome would define more than just James's future, it would shape Eleanor's understanding of justice, fairness, and the fragility of truth in a system designed to find it. The courtroom was a study in controlled chaos as the trial neared its breaking point. Tensions rippled through every bench and corner, the stakes rising with each new revelation. Judge Eleanor Hayes felt the weight of the proceedings pressing harder with every passing hour. The truth, in all its tangled, imperfect forms, seemed to slip further from reach, leaving Eleanor grasping at shadows. For James Anderson, this trial wasn't just about proving his innocence, it was a battle for his very humanity in a system designed to erase it. The prosecution, sensing the tide beginning to turn, doubled down on its efforts to solidify the narrative of James's guilt. Richard Powell called an unexpected witness, a store owner from a neighboring area who claimed to have encountered James weeks before the robbery. "Mr. Davis," Powell began, his tone confident, "you testified that you saw the defendant in your store behaving suspiciously. Can you elaborate?" The man, wiry and grizzled, adjusted his glasses. He was pacing near the counter, looking over his shoulder. "I thought he might be planning to steal something. I told him to leave." Lisa Porter's objection was swift. "Your Honor, relevance." Powell countered smoothly. "It establishes a pattern of behavior." Eleanor's gavel struck. "Overruled. Proceed, but keep it brief." Lisa's cross-examination dismantled the testimony piece by piece. "Mr. Davis, did the defendant steal anything from your store?" "No, but..." "Did you file a report with the police about his so-called suspicious behavior?" "No," Davis admitted, his voice faltering. "So, your testimony is based entirely on your perception, not on any verifiable facts. Is that correct?" The witness's silence spoke volumes. Eleanor watched the jury carefully, noting their shifting expressions. Powell's attempt to establish a pattern was weak at best, But Eleanor knew juries often latched onto the faintest hints of guilt. The system's imperfections loomed larger than ever. The defense took its turn with an audacious move. Lisa called Marcus Green, James's hesitant alibi witness, to the stand. Marcus's reluctance was palpable as he avoided eye contact with both James and the jury. "Mr. Green," Lisa began gently, "can you confirm where James Anderson was on the night of the alleged robbery?" Marcus shifted in his seat. "He was at my house. We were watching the game. Why didn't you come forward earlier?" Lisa asked, her voice soft but insistent. Marcus's voice dropped to a near whisper. "I was scared. People in our neighborhood don't trust the system. Speaking up doesn't always end well." Lisa's follow-up was pointed. "But you're here now. Why?" Marcus glanced at James, then at the jury. "Because it's the truth. And I couldn't live with myself if I didn't say it." The room seemed to hold its breath as Marcus stepped down. Eleanor saw the impact on the jury, their doubt growing, their certainty wavering. Yet Powell struck back, painting Marcus as a biased friend whose testimony couldn't be trusted. Then came the moment Eleanor had been dreading. James himself took the stand. Shackled and visibly weary, he faced the courtroom with a quiet defiance. Lisa had prepared him meticulously, but nothing could truly shield him from the scrutiny that awaited. "Mr. Anderson," Lisa began, "can you tell the court where you were on the night of the robbery?" "I was walking home from Marcus's place," James said, his voice steady. "The cops stopped me a few blocks from the store. They said I fit the description. I told them they had the wrong guy, but they didn't care." Powell's cross-examination was brutal. "Mr. Anderson, isn't it true that you have a criminal record?" "Yes," James admitted, his tone clipped. "And isn't it also true that you've been arrested for theft before?" "Yes, but I didn't do this." "Why should the jury believe you now?" Powell's words were sharp and calculated. James's gaze didn't waver. "Because the truth doesn't change, no matter how much you try to twist it." The courtroom fell silent, James's words hanging in the air. Eleanor felt a surge of admiration for his courage, even as she fought to maintain her judicial neutrality. The trial reached its climax with closing arguments. Powell's delivery was forceful, hammering home the narrative of guilt. "Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence is clear. The defendant was near the scene, and his past shows a pattern of criminal behavior. Justice demands accountability." Lisa's rebuttal was impassioned. "This case isn't about justice, it's about assumptions. Assumptions based on incomplete evidence and a flawed system. Don't let prejudice decide this man's fate." Eleanor's heart pounded as the jury filed out to deliberate. Hours passed, the weight of the decision pressing down on everyone in the room. She retreated to her chambers, staring blankly at the stack of legal briefs on her desk. The memories of her childhood with James were relentless, each one a reminder of the bond they'd shared and the promise she'd failed to keep. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom was electric with anticipation. Eleanor's hands trembled as she called for order, her voice steady despite the storm within her. "In the case of the State of Louisiana versus James Anderson," the foreperson began, "we find the defendant." The jury's deliberations stretched into the next day, casting a shadow of unease over the courthouse. Judge Eleanor Hayes sat in her chambers, the weight of the trial pressing harder with every passing moment. The steady routine she had relied upon for years now felt like a fragile veneer, cracking under the strain of what this case represented. James Anderson was no longer just another defendant, he was the living embodiment of a past Eleanor had tried to forget and a future she feared to confront. The courtroom hummed with tense anticipation when the jury returned. Reporters scribbled notes, families whispered nervously, and even the attorneys seemed caught in the charged atmosphere. Eleanor composed herself as she re-entered the courtroom, her gavel striking sharply to call the proceedings to order. "The jury has reached a verdict," the foreperson announced. But before the words could be spoken, Eleanor's gaze shifted to James. He sat silently at the defense table, his hands clasped together as though bracing for impact. Lisa Porter leaned in to murmur a final word of reassurance, her expression a delicate mix of resolve and concern. The foreperson's words would have to wait. Powell, the prosecutor, suddenly rose to his feet. "Your Honor," he said, his voice clipped but charged with urgency. Before the verdict is delivered, the prosecution requests to introduce a supplemental witness. This is a matter of procedural necessity. Gasps rippled through the room, and Lisa immediately objected. Your Honor, this is highly irregular, she said, her voice steady but laced with barely contained anger. The jury has deliberated. Introducing new evidence now is an affront to the integrity of this trial. Eleanor's pulse quickened. Mr. Powell, explain the relevance and urgency of this request. Powell squared his shoulders. A witness has come forward with information that could significantly impact the case. To exclude it at this stage would risk a miscarriage of justice. The weight of his words settled heavily over the room. Eleanor's mind raced, balancing the need for procedural fairness against the potential for truth. Objection noted, she finally said, but the court will allow the testimony. Proceed, Mr. Powell. Lisa's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing in frustration. James remained motionless, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. The energy in the courtroom shifted as Powell called the witness, an elderly woman named Clara Morrison. Clara's frail frame belied a sharp presence. She took the stand slowly but with purpose, her eyes scanning the room before settling on James. There was a flicker of recognition in her gaze, and Eleanor's stomach tightened. Mrs. Morrison, Powell began, you claim to have information regarding the night of the alleged robbery. Please share your account with the court. Clara adjusted her glasses, her hands trembling slightly. I was walking home from church that evening, she said, her voice steady despite her evident nerves. I saw a man in a red hoodie running past me, holding what looked like a bundle of cash. He disappeared into an alleyway. Did you recognize this man? Powell pressed. Clara hesitated, her eyes darting toward James. I think it might have been him, she said reluctantly. But I can't be certain. It was dark, and I didn't get a clear look. Lisa seized the opening. Rising to her feet, she approached the witness with a calm but assertive demeanor. Mrs. Morrison, she began, thank you for your testimony. You mentioned it was dark. Can you confirm whether you saw the man's face? No, I can't, Clara admitted. And yet you suggested it might have been my client. On what basis? Lisa's tone was firm but respectful. Clara fidgeted with the hem of her blouse. I don't know. I've seen his picture on the news. Maybe that influenced me. So your identification is based on a possibility, not a certainty. Yes, Clara said, her voice barely audible. Eleanor felt a pang of empathy for the woman, thrust into the spotlight with an account that now seemed more speculative than substantive. Lisa's cross-examination dismantled the testimony with surgical precision, but the damage had been done. The jury's faces were unreadable, their thoughts impossible to gauge. As Clara stepped down, Powell delivered his final flourish, arguing that her testimony reinforced the broader narrative of guilt. But Lisa's closing rebuttal was a masterclass in persuasion, highlighting the inconsistencies, the circumstantial nature of the evidence, and the systemic flaws that had brought James to trial in the first place. This case, she said, her voice rising with passion, is not just about one man. It's about the assumptions we make, the biases we carry, and the courage it takes to see beyond them. James Anderson is not guilty. He is a man who deserves more from us, from this system, from this society. Eleanor's chest tightened as Lisa returned to her seat. The room fell into a heavy silence as the jury prepared to deliberate once more. The tension was almost unbearable, the courtroom holding its collective breath as the final pieces of the trial slid into place. Eleanor dismissed the jury to their chambers, her gavel striking with a finality that reverberated through the room. The climax was near the moment when everything would either collapse or coalesce into some semblance of truth. James was led out in chains, his face unreadable, and Eleanor sat alone at the bench, her fingers tracing the wood's smooth surface. She had always believed in the law's capacity for justice, but this trial had shaken her faith. What was justice when the tools to achieve it were so deeply flawed? And what was her role in a system that seemed designed to fail people like James? As she rose to leave, Eleanor made a silent vow. No matter the verdict, she would not let this trial or the man at its center fade into obscurity. Justice, she realized, wasn't just a verdict. It was a commitment, a fight that didn't end when the gavel fell. The courtroom was silent, a taut stillness descending as the jury filed back into the room. Every eye was on the foreperson, the weight of the moment palpable. Judge Eleanor Hayes gripped the edge of her bench, her fingers pressing into the wood. She glanced at James Anderson, who sat motionless, his hands clasped together in a quiet prayer or resignation. The chains at his wrists clinked softly as he shifted slightly in his seat. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady despite the storm within her. The foreperson nodded, her hands trembling as she unfolded the piece of paper in her hands. "We have, Your Honor. Please read the verdict." The foreperson cleared her throat. "In the case of the State of Louisiana versus James Anderson, we find the defendant not guilty." The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, and a smattering of cheers filled the space, the energy vibrating through the air like an unrelenting pulse. Eleanor struck her gavel sharply. "Order! Order in the court!" James's shoulders sagged as though a tremendous weight had been lifted. His hands rose to cover his face, his body shaking with emotion. Lisa Porter reached out, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder, a small smile of relief breaking through her professional demeanor. Across the room, Richard Powell's face was a mask of barely concealed frustration, his jaw tight as he gathered his papers. "Mr. Anderson," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the noise, "you are free to go. This court is adjourned." She struck the gavel again, and the room began to empty, though the buzz of emotion lingered like a tangible force. James rose slowly, his movements deliberate, as though he were testing the reality of his freedom. He turned to Lisa, his voice hoarse as he whispered, "Thank you. You earned this," Lisa replied softly. "You fought for it." Eleanor watched the scene from her bench, her gavel now resting quietly at her side. She felt a complex swell of emotions, relief, hope, but also a gnawing ache. Justice had been served, but the trial had illuminated the fragility of the system she had dedicated her life to. She stood, preparing to retreat to her chambers, when she saw James approaching. He stopped a few feet from the bench, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since the trial began. There was no anger in his gaze, no resentment. Only a quiet understanding. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion layered within it. "Not just for today, but for seeing me. For listening." Eleanor's throat tightened. She wanted to say something profound, something that would bridge the chasm of years and experiences that had separated them. But all she could manage was a small nod. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Anderson." James held her gaze for a moment longer before turning and walking away, his steps growing steadier with each passing moment. Eleanor watched him go, the chains that had bound him now discarded, though the marks they had left on him, on her, on the system itself, remained. As the courtroom emptied, Eleanor lingered at the bench, her thoughts swirling. The verdict was a victory, yes, but it was also a reminder of how close James had come to losing everything. It wasn't just the evidence that had failed him, it was a system riddled with bias, assumption, and imperfection. Eleanor's faith in the law had been shaken, but it had also been refined, tempered by the realization that justice was not a passive ideal. It was an active, relentless pursuit, one that demanded more of her than she had ever imagined. She rose, her black robes trailing behind her as she made her way to her chambers. The echoes of the trial still lingered, but so did the resolve in her chest. James Anderson had been given his freedom, but Eleanor knew the fight was far from over. For him. For others like him. And for a system that still had so far to go. The courthouse was quiet now, the storm of the trial finally over. Judge Eleanor Hayes sat alone in her chambers, the room bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. The faint hum of distant voices and footsteps drifted through the closed door, but inside, there was only silence, a moment of reflection after days of turmoil. James Anderson was free. The jury's verdict had been clear, and the weight of those two words, "not guilty," still echoed in Eleanor's mind. She thought of James's face as he left the courtroom, the tentative hope mingling with years of weariness. It wasn't just his freedom he had reclaimed, it was a chance to rewrite a story that had long been dictated by others. Yet, Eleanor couldn't shake the lingering unease. The trial had laid bare the fragility of the system she had sworn to uphold. James had come perilously close to losing everything, not because the evidence was overwhelming, but because the odds had been stacked against him from the start. It was a sobering reminder that justice was not guaranteed, even in a court of law. Her thoughts drifted to Lisa Porter, whose steadfast defense had been nothing short of extraordinary. Lisa had fought not just for James's innocence, but for his humanity, challenging every assumption and exposing every flaw in the prosecution's case. Eleanor made a mental note to write a letter commending Lisa's work not just as a judge, but as someone who understood the importance of what had transpired in her courtroom. Eleanor's gaze fell to the photograph on her desk, a black and white image of herself as a child, standing beside her father. She thought of Hammond, Louisiana, and the summer days she had spent with James. Back then, the world had seemed simpler, their friendship unbreakable. But life had taught them both that simplicity was an illusion, and fairness was a fragile thing, often lost in the tangled complexities of race, class, and circumstance. A knock at the door pulled her from her reverie. It was Margaret, her ever-reliable assistant. "Judge Hayes, the courthouse is closing soon. Is there anything else you need?" Eleanor shook her head, offering a small smile. "No, Margaret. Thank you. I'll be out in a moment." As Margaret left, Eleanor stood, smoothing her robes and gathering her things. The trial was over, but the work was not. James's case was a victory, yes, but it was also a call to action, a reminder that justice was not static. It was something to be fought for, re-examined, and refined every day. Stepping into the empty hallway, Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had always believed in the law, but now she understood that belief alone was not enough. It was time to use her position not just to preside over cases, but to push for a system that truly served everyone. For James. For the countless others like him. For the ideals of justice she had sworn to uphold. If this story of justice, resilience, and the fight against systemic bias captivated you, don't miss our next deep dive into the complexities of the legal system. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications to stay informed and inspired by more powerful narratives like James Anderson's journey. What would you have done in Judge Hayes's position? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your perspective in the comments below and join a community committed to justice and meaningful conversations. Did you catch all the pivotal moments that led to James Anderson's freedom? Let us know your favorite part of this gripping trial in the comments, and don't forget to like and share this story with others who value justice and truth.